area is established on the African continent. And basically, what we found out is that Africa's exports would grow, but this will be mainly in intra-African trade. Part of this is that the reason, the explanation is that when Africa exports to the rest of the world, the tariffs that African countries face are relatively low. It's on average is about 2%. But when Africa exports to Africa, in other words, African countries are exporting to one another, average tariffs are high, which is 8%. So once you bring down these tariffs in a consolidated market, you would expect exports, intra-African exports to grow. And that's exactly what the modeling results showed. It also showed that there will be an increase in Africa's GDP and overall welfare would increase. And specifically, it showed that the share of intra-African trade, that's Africa's exports to Africa, would more than double, and that about 2/3 of that would go to value-added products, so if you like, industrial products. And the specific sectors which we expect to benefit would include milk, dairy, sugar, processed food, chemicals, textiles, apparel, leather, wood, vehicle, transport, electronic, and other manufacture. So if we come back to the initial problem that I posed, that this dependency on commodities that has held back growth in Africa and so on, then clearly this having a consolidated market in a free trade area can potentially transform the African economies. Let me go to the next slide, and what I want to show here is that our modeling also shows that although, of course, you have countries on the continent at different stages of development, as we say, proverbially, that Africa is not just one country, there are several countries, different stages of development, etc. But what the modeling results also show, and this is somewhat counterintuitive, is that the African LDCs will benefit as much as the non-LDCs. In other words, the least developed countries in Africa, the fragile states, can potentially benefit as much as the developing African countries, if you like, the countries that are not LDCs, that are not fragile states, and so on. And what we found was that looking at value-added products, that the least developed countries their gains could be as much as 75% for value-added products or industrial type products. And then 5.3% for energy and almost 20% for food and agriculture. And then, of course, the developing African countries are also expected to gain, as you can see from this diagram. Now, I said this is counterintuitive, but the explanation behind this is that these gains for the least developed countries is partly because they're starting from a low base, and secondly, because there's a strong expectation that they would participate in regional value chains. In other words, are not necessarily expected to be the manufacturers of final products, but will be providing inputs for manufacturing that may well be taking place elsewhere. So, you know, for the big economies like Nigeria or Ghana or Kenya, South Africa, Egypt, etc., you'll find that there is an opportunity in a free trade area market for the least developed countries to provide inputs into manufacturing and processing that may happen elsewhere. We also found that we should expect tariff revenue loss, because when you bring down the tariffs, as I said, they're 8% on average for the African countries. When you bring this down to zero or close to zero, you would expect, of course, the government would lose revenue. But what we found was that the tariff revenues that are lost could be mitigated by the increase in trade that would occur as a result of the AfCFTA. There's already an effort to put in place an adjustment facility to help countries that suffer from revenue loss, and I'll be talking about that a little later. And then, of course, we do expect that the gains, which for both LDCs and non-LDCs that I'm showing here, that these could even be multiplied if you're looking at also the liberalization of trade in services. So services like financial services, professional services, business services, all of which are crucial for industrial production, for value-added production. If you think about it, transport, communications, business services all go into the production of goods. So that if you liberalize services and you achieve regulatory convergence for services so that all the countries have the same treat services in the same way across the continent, that you would have even greater gains. And the same for reducing the non-tariff measures. That is, if you can eliminate the issues at the border, whether it's customs inefficiency, or even if it's just plain corruption, that if you can deal with those problems at the border, the gains, overall gains, would even be much more than what we modeled, which was looking specifically at trading in goods. Um, a couple of other points that we should sort of take into account. Um, we recognize that it's important to bring into the equation the issue of inclusion, that that yes, indeed, trade gains are not necessarily leave everyone better off, that some groups or parts of society could find themselves gaining much more from the liberalization episode, and there's a lot of evidence around this. Also, not just inclusion in terms of inequalities, but also in relation to gender as well. That again, a lot of evidence to show that men benefit more than women, etc. So the point that we wanted to make here was that these aspects relating to poverty, inequalities, uh, certainly part of, if you like, the negative part of trade liberalization, requiring specific policies to deal with them. The same with the question of climate change. What again the modeling is showing, and we continue to do some work on this, is that as you expand trade, it also means that there is a knock-on effect. You're expanding production, you're expanding transport, you're expanding energy, etc. And if most of your energy is based on fossil fuels, as they are in most of the African countries, then your impact on climate change and so on would be somewhat negative. So there are all these issues which again could be addressed and could actually help Africa's transition to a greener kind of growth if these issues are addressed through appropriate policies. Again, I'll come back to this, but basically we're in fact now doing some modeling work which would give us an idea of the impact on Africa's carbon emissions from expansion in trade. But basically, we now live in a world where you cannot just talk about trade expansion without also talking about, what would this mean for the climate? Because these are now important issues. Similarly, you cannot talk about trade expansion without bringing into the equation what this means for inequalities, and given that we know that there are considerable inequalities already. So these are all areas that we continue to work on, but we're flagging them because we do recognize that from the outset, this deal should be implemented in a way that there are complementary policies that deal with these important issues as well. Issues relating, as I said, to inequalities, gender, climate change, and so on. However, what I'm doing now, of course, is sharing with you these modeling results, which we're doing quite extensively, in speeches, in advocacy, in relation to capacity building, and so on, so that there's a better understanding and a greater understanding of the potentially transformative impact of this trade deal, but all the same to also understand the issues that also potentially negative. What I want to talk about now is, of course, we're coming out of a pandemic, hopefully, as vaccines get better distributed, again, hopefully, and so on. African economies, of course, had negative growth during 2020. On average, it's something like 2%. Although there is some very interesting evidence showing that trade between African countries declined much less than Africa's trade with the rest of the world, which again is another good argument for boosting intra-African trade. But the point I want to make is that, yes, this deal could assist with the COVID-19 recovery. But all of what I've said is not automatic. The modeling results would not just fall from the sky and make everything perfect. There are a number of things that African countries themselves have to do, and which they're already doing. The first is to ratify the agreement, because only about 38 of them, of the 54 signatories, have actually ratified the agreement to make the agreement legally binding on them. Then secondly, they need to implement the agreement effectively. And this means that they must have their own strategies. You recall I said that even least developed countries can benefit, but that means that they need to identify the specific products, the specific sectors that they want to boost their trade in, and especially since we are talking about the potential of regional value chains, those regional value chains that would be especially important for them. As you change and transform economies, the skill sets that you need are going to change. So investment in skills and education is key as well. We have identified this. And then also, of course, it's the private sector that needs to be fully incentivized to take advantage of this trade agreement. Um, Development partners who are strongly behind this agreement, this is what we find, that Africa's development partners, whether it's the IMF, the World Bank, bilateral partners, all strongly behind this agreement. And just incidentally, modeling work carried out by the IMF, the World Bank, and UNCTAD also confirm the results that I have just outlined to you. So there's very strong consensus behind this agreement, but it also means that development partners and investors coming into Africa should prioritize those sectors of the economy that would boost the transformative potential of this deal. So infrastructure, services, logistics, health, education, agriculture, agribusiness, these are all key sectors that would require investment by Africa's partners. Because these are the sectors that would drive the potential to achieve the promise of this AfCFTA. The other point that comes from our research is that the African market is proving to be quite attractive to foreign partners, to foreign investors. And so we have seen, for example, Britain after Brexit is talking about bilateral trade deals with Nigeria, with Kenya, Ghana, etc. And many of these deals already have been signed, even though it's mainly a rollover of the deals that Britain enjoyed as part of being as part of the EU, the Economic Partnership Agreements. The US, China, of course, all partners that are looking at getting a slice of the African market. And again, although I did say at the beginning that Africa's GDP, 2.4 trillion, before the pandemic, is an attractive market. And within that market, you have about 300 million Africans out of a population of 1.2 billion, about 300 million Africans with a spending power of anything up to about $20 a day. So the African middle class is small, but it's growing. So it is an attractive market. But what we're saying is that the sequencing of these agreements with Africa's partners is something that should be looked at very carefully, because these gains in intra-African trade will only come about by having a preferential market which provides preferential access to the African participants in that market, but not the same level of access to the external partners. So what we're saying is that the AfCFTA is going to need about 15, 20 years to really be consolidated into a single market. Um, and it's at that stage that we're recommending that these bilateral deals would make sense for Africa. That currently, what the African countries need is to be able to have a trade relationship with all these partners, whether it's the UK and so on, without a reciprocal type of trade arrangement, meaning to say that the partners come into the African market by offering the same access to their own markets, that the African countries are much poorer than these other countries, so that what should be the norm for the next 15 to 20 years is to allow Africa to integrate and then have this reciprocity. The African economies, I don't need to expand on this, are asymmetrical when you compare them with the economies of the developed world, and it makes no sense whatsoever at this point in time to be having these reciprocal deals. So whether it's the UK, it's the US, it's China, basically with this kind of asymmetry, what they're doing is actually undermining the potential, this transformative potential of the AfCFTA. So this is one of the another insight from our from our research. Now, very quickly, let me take you through what the deal is all about. It is it is called the African Continental Free Trade Area, but it is much more than a free trade area. It is a free trade area is typically an agreement, a preferential agreement on trading goods. But this deal includes not just trading goods, but also trading services. It includes arrangements for the settlement of disputes. It includes uh, um, future negotiations, which are expected to begin later this year, that will cover investment, competition, intellectual property, and e-commerce. So once you move out of just goods, you're actually moving in the direction of a single market, which is, I guess, the direction that the African countries want to go. Let me just emphasize, this is not creating a European Union, so there's nothing like the EU institutions like the Commission coordinating all of this. What the Africans have done is to set up a small secretariat, which is located now in Accra, to oversee the implementation of the deal. but they're not looking at the deep integration, which including the various political aspects as well at this stage. So what they're looking at is economic integration, not getting into the sort of political integration, the creating supranational institutions like you have in the EU. They have not gone that far. This is more about economic integration. So basically, this is what the agreement covers. If you like, another way of looking at this is that under or through this agreement, the African countries are introducing what you might call a continent-wide system of trade governance. Up till now, of course, you've had regional economic communities like ECOWAS, the East African Community, SADC, COMESA, etc. But these were focused on their regions and the small economies in their regions, because again, going back to my first slide, that this is about consolidating the African economies. The idea here is to go beyond what you have in the regional economic communities, to have this continent-wide system of trade governance with the same rules applying throughout the continent. So far, the negotiations for the protocol on trading goods, this is almost done. 86% of the tariff lines have been agreed for the goods of origin, which is basically in this preferential free trade market, to say that the goods that will enjoy these lower tariffs would be goods that are made and produced in Africa. And 41 countries have submitted their new schedules of tariff concessions. As I said, the idea is to bring the tariffs down to zero over time. And so these new tariffs have to be published in a schedule so that everybody knows what the new tariffs are. They've also made progress on trading services. As I said, this deal includes services with the 5 priority sectors that are to be prioritized: financial services, transport, telecoms, professional services, tourism. They've made some progress there, and 33 countries have submitted offers. The WTO recognizes 12 services sectors, so we would expect that over time, additional services sectors will be added to this list. For example, education, health, environmental services. In fact, we have carried out research to show that these areas also need to be prioritized, especially education and health, given also coming out of this pandemic situation. The arrangements for settling disputes, I don't really have the time to get into them, but basically the expectation is that in trade, you always have disputes. One country or the other feel that their rights have been abridged in some way or the other. So there are provisions on how this could be done in a systematic way. Then, as I've said, there will be further negotiations on investment, intellectual property, competition policy, and e-commerce. They're now looking at the completing these negotiations perhaps next year, even though the deadline is this year there, but realistically they're looking at next year for this. These are the countries that have signed the agreement as of just a couple of weeks ago when we checked. 37 countries had signed the agreement. 37 countries had ratified the agreement, and altogether 54 countries have actually signed the agreement. One country made no commitment, and that's Eritrea. Now, in order to be a state party to the agreement, it's not just enough to be a member of the African Union. You must actually ratify the agreement, which means that you are legally accepting the protocols that constitute the agreement. And as I said, here 37 countries have completed this process. We know that different countries have different speeds. For some countries, it's just the legislature that needs to ratify. For some countries, it's both the executive and the legislature. For some countries, it's a combination of both and so on. So there are different speeds, but we do expect that the 54 countries that have signed will eventually ratify. And as of now, only 17 countries have not yet ratified. Since this is a legal treaty based on protocols and so on, basically, to benefit from it, you must be a state party. And what I show in this slide, the benefits for the countries that have actually ratified as opposed to those that have not. Let me just highlight a couple of them. Of course, the first one is the access to the preferential AfCFTA market on the zero tariffs eventually, and so on. Another one is that to be treated as a most favored nation, MFN, which means that any other deal that an individual state party makes with a third party. So if Kenya and the UK sign an agreement, that agreement should not be better than what the AfCFTA offers, because they have this most favored nation treatment. Of course, harmonized laws and standards. As I said, this is a new system of trade governance that is being put in place, and so on, a more predictable system. You can no longer just go close the border, as we have seen. Even very recently, Benin and Nigeria just arbitrarily closing the border. So a much more predictable system and a dispute management mechanism, and so on. Now, turning to the country implementation strategies, as I've said, all of the benefits that we project, that through modeling, etc., are not automatic. Countries have to do their own homework, and some of them are doing this. As of now, we know that 38 countries have developed their AfCFTA strategies. Three regional economic communities have done the same. The countries are now in the process of validating the strategies, that is bringing stakeholders together, look at the strategies and how this will play out in practice, and so on. 9 countries actually moving towards implementation on that path now, have gone beyond just the strategies to implementation. And increasingly, they're taking all these issues into account, gender, youth, environment, the impact on urbanization, trade expands, digitalization, customs, communications, all these issues are sort of being taken into account. And also we are seeing that some countries are putting in place systems for monitoring, evaluating if the benefits are flowing, and that kind of thing. So these sorts of integrated approaches, which I think all of this augurs really very well. At the ECA, we're also looking at putting in place what we are calling an AfCFTA Country Business Index to monitor independently what is happening, to measure, as indicate here among the objectives, what is happening on the ground, how it is affecting businesses, things improving, and so on. And then what are the gaps, and what could be done about them. I could come back to this. I don't want to take too much time on it, but just to say that what we're trying to do is to create something that is similar to the World Bank's doing business, ease of doing business surveys, and to carry out periodic surveys focused on the AfCFTA to see what is actually happening on the ground, what is changing, and so on. And on the right of the screen, you would see the various issues that we think we should be looking at to see what is changing or not. And also I've given some preliminary results here of the pilots that was done in Zambia and Cameroon. Basically, the pilots did not produce a very good outcome at this point in time, as you can see from the very low scores. But we do recognize that these are early days, and even in those two countries, implementation is at a very rudimentary stage. But it was to give us an idea of how this index would work in practice. We're going to pilot it in 12 more countries to get a better sense. In other words, what this is pointing to, and this is the main point, is that there have been many grant schemes on the continent before, but I think this one is different. It's different because of the efforts that is being put into implementation, as you have mentioned, the country strategies, etc. But then through initiatives such as this, to actually go back and survey businesses to get a sense of whether anything is changing and in what way, and so on, and to look really at the key dimensions that can illuminate this aspect, and to be much more robust in analyzing what is actually happening on the ground. Um, in this slide, I also wanted to just highlight uh, how important it is to ensure that gender-related issues are very much taken into account in the way that implementation of the AfCFTA is carried out, and also the work that we're doing in this area. As it happens, uh, African women are very strong in trade. In fact, for informal trade, we estimate that over 70% of the traders are women, and all a number of issues related to that have not gone well in the past. So here there is a significant effort that is being made to ensure that as this deal is implemented, that women traders also can benefit from it. And the same with as I mentioned earlier, in regard to greening, if you like, the AfCFTA, where we're undertaking further research to understand better the kind of impact you would expect on carbon emissions as trade expands. And that's basically what so just showing in this slide. Now, as I come to the end, I just want to highlight a couple of other things, and then I'll finish. I mentioned earlier that as the revenue from customs duties come down, of course, governments are going to feel the pinch, if you like. There's going to be a decline in customs revenue, and for all governments, losing this kind of revenue is always an issue that they have to deal with. And we all know that fiscal space in African countries it's already constrained, as we're seeing from the resurgence of the debt-related issues, etc. The African Export-Import Bank has come forward with a 1 billion facility that will be provided through on a loan basis to countries that may need short to medium term support for dealing with revenue losses. And the bank is trying to raise additional funds from international markets to help to deal with this problem. For many countries, they can also access support from IFIs, international financial institutions like the IMF, that has is putting in place on a country by country basis support for dealing with the problems related to tariff revenue loss. Another important initiative I thought I should mention is what is known as the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System that is also being put in place. Basically, what this is about is that, as we all know, for one African country to trade with another, the payments are usually done in, if you like, what we call hard currencies, so especially the dollar. The idea here is that an exporter, say in Kenya, will receive shillings in payment. Excuse me, will receive shillings in payment for the exports, and then the importer who would have to otherwise pay in dollars would pay in their own currency. So if you have two traders in Kenya and Nigeria, when the Kenya exports to Nigeria, they will receive shillings, and then the partner in Nigeria would only need to use the Nigerian naira. The way this is going to work is that the Nigerian naira will be put into a basket along with other receipts from exports, whether it's from Kenya or wherever, all goes into a basket. Um, and then out of this basket is taken the shillings that are needed to pay the Kenyan exporter. And the Nigerian um, trader pays the naira into the basket. So there's no need to use a quote unquote hard currency like the dollar, etc. Now, it's the Afrexim Bank that is setting up this system, and basically they see it as a way of as a profitable line of business, because basically what they need to do is create this pool of funds into which the naira is paid, the shillings are paid, or whatever are paid, and then to take out of those funds the exact currency to pay the exporter that has sent goods to Nigeria or whatever. And then, of course, they do this for with an arbitrage, so they do take a cut, if you like, a cut out of the transactions. So all of these transactions, of course, will be carried out in African currencies. But then the bank, of course, has its own cut, its own share of the transactions. So this is expected to help to ease the problem of trading in foreign exchange between the African countries. It's not an idea that's entirely new to the African continent, because to some extent it's been done in East Africa and also in French West Africa to a large extent. They are using payments in the local currencies. Then finally, I thought I would just end by again highlighting this initiative, which is an AU initiative on safe movement across borders during this COVID crisis. A number of guidelines that have been put in place to ensure that truck drivers and others who are crossing borders can do so safely. Again, I don't want to take up too much time, but basically, the number of guidelines that have been put in place for this aspect of trading across borders. But we could come back to it if anyone has some specific questions on it. So let me stop here. I think I've taken a little longer than I expected, but then I do hope that I've covered the main aspects of this continental deal, its potential, the various aspects of implementing it, the various issues that need to be taken into account, and then these various initiatives that are there to support the implementation. So let me stop here, and I'll be glad to take questions in the time that is remaining. So back to you, Gillian and Stephen.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for the talk and the information. So yeah, please just raise your hand to ask a question, or just unmute and you can ask your question to David straight away. Can't see any hands raised, so just feel free to unmute your mic if you want to ask a question.
can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Hi, my name is Leila, and I have one question related to maybe like the implementation of the that free trade area. And first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. You gave me a great background on that scheme. So my question is that since Africa already has a little more than a dozen um, regional economic communities that have had some varying level of success or even of integration. So, what are some of the steps that now this continental free trade area is going to take in order to bypass or to overcome the barriers that have occurred during first that have occurred within the implementation of those regional economic communities. And we know that some of those barriers have been political and also economical. And also how would the African continental free trade area is going also to harmonize those different regional economic communities among others.
Okay. I don't know if we to take other questions. I'm happy to respond to this one whilst perhaps other questions are coming forward. Um, shall I proceed or wait for other questions?
There's another question, so do you want to take that question?
Okay.
Okay, yeah, Keith and Temidayo, so Keith first.
Thank you for presenting. I hope we can get a copy of your presentation. I found it very informative. I've heard the discussions about the free trade area, and it's put people on two sides. I'm yet to meet someone who's completely neutral about it, so it's interesting to see a purely neutral academic point of view. On the Pan-African payments and settlement system, which I think is an area of interest for me, I don't envy the treasurers at Afreximbank, but I'd like to understand, given the increasing volume of trade with China, if at any point within the basket of settlement currencies, there will be consideration for the entry of the Chinese yuan, or its very recent newly born cousin, the digital yuan.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So perhaps I could start with these two. Um, okay. For the first question, in regard to the regional economic communities and which have had different levels of success and what changes with, what will change with the AfCFTA, and what does this mean for their programs, including for harmonization and integration at the regional level. Um, Let me go back to what I said at the beginning, that this AfCFTA is an effort at consolidating the African economies, giving the relative small size of the economies and the scale issues, etc. So this agreement then applies at the continental level. It does not apply at the regional level. So potentially then, not even potentially, practically there'll be two trade regimes on the continent. When Nigeria is trading with Kenya, because they're both not in ECOWAS or in EAC, they're different regional economic communities, Nigeria and Kenya will be trading on AfCFTA terms. Now, when Uganda and Kenya are trading, Uganda and Kenya have the option to trade on the EAC terms because they're both in the same economic community. And remember what I said, that this is not an effort to create a European Union style arrangement. It's just to consolidate the market and expand the market. There is no appetite, as it appears, to go beyond that at this stage in policy on economic integration on the continent. So basically what this means is that at the sub-regional level, there's still that option for the RECs to do what they have been doing. And actually, we're seeing that the RECs can be important building blocks for the continental market. For example, it is the RECs that make policy in regard to transport links, the transport corridors, say take Mombasa, Kigali corridor that comes under the EAC. You cannot have a secretariat that is far away in Accra looking into these local regional issues. So that's a big plus for having directs like the EAC dealing with transport networks, dealing with policy coordination and a whole range of sectoral or in a whole range of sectoral areas, etc. Even the question of education standards. Again, recall that I did say that one of the big challenges implementing the AfCFTA is that African education and skills need to be upgraded significantly as trade expands and as the economies expand. So educational standards, all these sorts of issues could best be dealt with at the sub-regional level with a smaller group of countries looking at these standards, harmonizing them, and working together on these standards. So for a continent that is as huge as the African continent, and don't forget that you can put Europe, North America, a big chunk of South America into the African continent, and there's still some more geographical space left, etc. So for a huge continent, you cannot centralize everything under the AfCFTA and run from Accra. That's not going to be possible. You still need the RECs for policies that are closer to the ground, if you like, and for arrangements that are closer to the ground. But then in terms of this new system of continent-wide trade governance, it makes it easier, especially for Africa's big economies that are all not in the same REC. South Africa in SADC, Nigeria in ECOWAS, Egypt in COMESA, strangely, even though it is not East or Southern African, but Egypt is a member of COMESA. So it makes sense for these big economies that are not in the same REC to be able to trade preferentially. So that is what is different, under the AfCFTA and in relation to the RECs. Now, for the second question, yes, indeed, I've found that Africans tend either to be for or against and hardly ever neutral about the AfCFTA, but that's the nature of integration. But specifically on the payment system, the plan at this stage is to use African currencies because don't forget, this is for payments within the preferential area. So there's no plan to use the Chinese renminbi, I believe it's actually called, and the digital version that is now emerging. The Afreximbank has talked about digital payment solutions as another possibility, and I think I highlighted that in the specific slide that I showed in regard to the payment system. But for the time being, it will be just African currencies, and it's to bring down the transaction cost among the African countries with well over, I believe the number is something like 27 different currencies on the African continent. So the idea is to bring down the transaction costs for using African currencies at this point. Over.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have one final question from Temida.
Yes, good evening, and thank you for the presentation. I was just going to ask very briefly, does the AfCFTA play any role in standardizing bilateral trade agreements between African countries and foreign trading partners such as the UK, the US, or China? Because I understand to a very large extent, trade agreements are usually Western country influenced, so usually based on terms dictated by mostly the European countries and American countries. But since the emergence of the AfCFTA, it will be interesting to see if AfCFTA plays any role in helping African countries standardize the way they negotiate their bilateral treaties, such that it favors more African countries rather than the interest of European nations. I think you're muted.
Unmute. Yes, sorry. Indeed. No, I was saying that this is a really very good question, and it's one of the areas that I hope to do more research on in my new role at the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa. Basically, what the evidence shows for now is that the best arrangement for the African countries is a non-reciprocal trade arrangement with developed countries, whether it is the US, the UK, China, whatever, which is to say that these developed countries allow African countries to send their exports duty-free into their markets because the African countries are much poorer. And that's only an intuitive point. And in the meantime, that the African economies, as they're integrating using this trade deal to integrate, will come to a point where they may be able at some stage, and we look at this in the next 15 to 20 years, be able to offer reciprocal market access to these big countries. So what we're suggesting now is that these bilateral deals are not in Africa's interest. And the modeling shows that when you have countries that are much more efficient in their production, much more competitive, basically they're going to displace your own production if you are less competitive and less efficient than they are. And that is the current situation. So this is, again, there's a long, sort of theoretical underpinning with many contributions to this, but basically it's the issue around the displacement of goods that are traded in these asymmetrical situations. On the other hand, what we are finding is that because a number of African countries have significant exports in developed countries, when a developed country comes to you to say, I want reciprocity, otherwise I'm going to close my market, then they are being forced to offer reciprocity. And this is what has happened to the developing African countries. If you take the relationship with Europe, basically Europe offers duty-free access to the least developed African countries. But then for developing countries like Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, etc., they insist on reciprocal access. And so it's basically forcing these countries to provide this reciprocity in return for accessing the EU market, because they're important exports into these markets for these countries. If you take, just give you one example from Kenya, cut flour in Kenya goes mainly to the EU, to Amsterdam. And if that market is closed, that sector will collapse in Kenya. So there are these dilemmas that African countries are being put in, which you could argue is unfair, just given the, the difference in the stage of development between the countries. Even a country like South Africa, which has a stronger industrial base, there's still an argument for giving South Africa non-reciprocal access, because South Africa has a huge problem with poverty as well, even though it does have an advanced and a significant industrial sector. So by no stretch of imagination, or even if you take other metrics, just looking at GDP, you look at Kenya's GDP or UK's GDP, what's the comparison? What are we talking about? Or you look at any other African country in relation to the EU or the US or China, again, what are we talking about? So, so the argument really is to continue with these duty-free arrangements with African countries rather than pushing them towards reciprocal market access. Let me just end with one point, and that is that the United States has taken this argument, at least until the last administration, Trump, of giving African countries non-reciprocal market access. And that's under the program that is known as the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which has been in place since 2001. So basically, for the African countries that qualify to export to the US, they can do so duty-free. But of course, the US has some conditions. For example, they must have democratic governance with clean elections, and not using slave labor or having problems with labor standards and that sort of thing. So there are a number of conditions that are there, but these are reasonable conditions. So that is what there has been the US policy. Under the Trump administration, they started to reverse that policy by trying to negotiate a deal with Kenya to say that Kenya could only export to the US if Kenya also gives the US the same kind of market access. And so they were looking at doing a free trade deal because it's important for Kenya. Kenya sends horticulture, tea, coffee, lots of other produce to the US on a duty-free basis. So that hit Kenya very hard. So to summarize, my own view is, and we do expect to do more research on this, is to show that it's premature to have these bilateral arrangements, and that developed countries should give Africa space to develop its own trade capacity, and then have these reciprocal arrangements. And as you've seen already, you can see for yourselves the effect on the streets of Africa, especially the way that Chinese goods are being dumped in African markets, displacing, what could be produced locally. Take any bunch of basket of goods, whether you're looking at toys, you're even looking at stationery. A lot of this stuff is coming from China, being done much more competitively than it could be produced locally. So there's very little scope to be able to develop these product sectors if you have to deal with this competition as well. But as I say, more research is needed to be much more granular on this, but this is what the evidence is pointing to right now.
Thank you so much, David. I'm just going to